I'm Mark Correll, Chair of the Department of History at Spring Arbor University. This video is meant to help you succeed in your introductory college history course. Episode 2. Every college history class is different. In the last episode, I discussed how the curriculum of high schools was focused on emphasizing civic values, where a college history class emphasizes thinking historically. Since the values are established from the state school boards, superintendents, and legislatures for high schools, they need to be sure that every high school teacher shows these values. They do this by creating grade-level standards. Ideally, every student at every high school in the state should learn about the same events and figures that embodied or undermined these civic virtues. Every pupil in the state also needs to take the same social studies classes. In history, these grade-level standards are more specific about content than in the other social studies disciplines of geography, civics, and economics, because history has so many different ways of expressing itself. So if you walk around your college campus and ask other students to explain what the New Deal was and how it affected the United States, you should get similar answers. In college, where the priority is thinking historically, there's a much lower expectation of a content minimum. Your college might not even require the same history class for every student. Even within nominally the same course, the content could vary drastically depending on the professor. This is especially true when it gets to the really big questions that drive academic history. Namely, what is the primary reason people do things? Is it economics, politics, ideas, or culture? An economic historian of U.S. history might argue that the Civil War wasn't a particularly important event, and will instead spend the entire time discussing the foundations of industrialization. While this is an extreme example, you might discuss history with friends at the same institution or at other institutions and find that they didn't cover the same materials at all. These differences are compounded by the significant time difference between high school and college history courses. Most high school courses have somewhere around 170 hours of class time, whereas the typical college course has less than 1/3 of that. This means that college professors are going to pick particular elements that resonate with them and hope that they carry significance to their students. My favorite story to teach my world civilization class is probably only taught by a handful of professors in the country. You see, my particular interest and focus on history is through intellectual changes which motivate mass movements. Since I'm interested in the modern era, I believe that the life and force of nationalism is perhaps the most defining aspect of the modern world. So I tell the story about student groups in Germany, known as Burschenschaften. They were university fraternities, but one made up of students who did not come from the nobility. In 1817, the tercentenary of Martin Luther's Reformation, students from various German-speaking universities met at the Wartburg, site of Luther's translation of the Bible into German. You see, in 1817 there was no unified Germany, and hadn't been for 13 years. But during Napoleon's occupation of the Holy Roman Empire, many German speakers' anger at the French began to lead them to a resolve for a united German nation. The defeat of Napoleon did not unite the German-speaking territories. Instead, they were left divided. These students met then, 2 years after Napoleon's final defeat, to discuss their dreams of a united Germany. This was dangerous and seditious work. Most university graduates at this time went to work for the government. At the Wartburg, they agreed to undermine their own governments to spark revolutions that would lead to the rise of a united Germany. In the years following, the so-called Carlsbad decrees were passed to give states the rights to police secret organizations like the Burschenschaften. All of these actions seem to culminate in the 1848 revolutions. You may have heard all of these aspects as they're commonly told in European history. But for me, the more fascinating aspects comes even later. Of course, the 1848 revolutions did not result in a united Germany. Instead, Germany was united by a series of wars in the 1860s and 1870s. So Germany was not united by idealistic youngsters standing up for their beliefs on barricades, but by other youngsters taking up arms against enemies. The ideal model of Germanness transitioned from 1817 to 1870, from the high-minded revolutionary patriot willing to die for his belief, to the hardened soldier willing to fight against foreign enemies. This idealized version of German identity filtered down to the Burschenschaften. What these fraternities became most known for at the end of the 19th century was the curious practice of Mensur, a practice of dueling where students from rival fraternities would stand within striking distance of their opponents and hack at each other with fencing swords that were sharp on the sides and dull at the end. The combatants would be armored from their feet to their necks with protective goggles to protect their eyes. Only their heads were exposed to the blades. By the end of the duel, one or both combatants would be a bloody mess, leaving their faces scarred. These scars, or Schmisse, would be worn by the students as badges of honor and prestige. This story is great because it is weird, fascinating, and kind of gory. But I share this because it succinctly describes the changes in society from the first half of the 19th century to the second half of the century, where civilian uprisings and the embrace of romantic revolutions driven by idealistic civilians was the model for students early on. By the end of the century, these same students showed how nationalism had transformed into a praise of militancy and armed authoritarianism. These changes were slow, gradual, and complex. But a novel story shows how gigantic these changes actually are. Good high school teachers everywhere pepper their classes with extra materials that they have learned, but they're always constrained by the curriculum requirements of their states. College professors, freed from this essentialist requirement, will often draw from other materials in order to guide you into thinking historically.